Hello and welcome to another Pixel Game Maker tutorial. Today we're going to go over lifting and throwing objects. We're going to particularly look at lifting up a pot and a bush and then being able to throw them. This is going to be a sample project, so it's going to be a little bit different than my scene and object imports. So it's going to be tagged with a project. It means you're just going to download the project, you're going to put it in your PGM folder in the documents, and then you're going to get going with it. And so with that said, let's get started. All right, so here's the scene you saw in the preview. We have just pots and bushes scattered everywhere. This video is not going to be a one-to-one remake. It's just going to be explaining this sample. There's a lot going on. I think it would be way too long of a video. All right, so here's the scene. We're going to get back to some things that we need to consider in the scene once we understand how the pickup's actually working. Okay, so if we go to the objects here, you can see that we have a player object and it has the throw logic in it. And then we also have some of these underscored object, which means that it's a connected object, particularly to the player for this one. And this is of a player lift check. All right, so this is going to be like a Raycast, which I put in parentheses. If you've used other engines where you can shoot out a line, and then if that line hits a detection, you can trigger something with it. And that's essentially what I'm doing here. So the reason that the Raycast is important, this little line, is that in your scene here, if you zoom in, if the object, the player, is standing right here and you're just using wall detection, well, his wall detection is touching both pots. And so when you go to lift up the object, you now lift up both pots, but yet you only have one on your head, and it looks kind of silly. So we're going to limit the range of what is liftable at that moment by using a raycast. And how I did it was quite simple. I just, in my player, in both the idle, or right here, that's right, it was just one animation. So I just created one animation, and you can see that it's a transparent one. And I just used one frame for all directions, but it is all directions. And you just got to make sure that you're using something that is very similar to the animation. That way it's all in the same position and all this other stuff. All right, but you take it and you adjust the opacity down all the way. And then what I did was I just set up a collision detection. You can see this right here. And this is going to be the line. This is the raycast that is pointing out in each direction. So you can see I have a left one, I have a right one, I have a down, and then I have an up. And if I was to unopacity this, you could see that that's where it is when I'm facing down. And you can also see, if I go to my wall detection, you can see the wall detection ends at the end of the shadow. So this raycast of the downward here is actually a couple pixels outside of that wall detection. And that's the important thing, is that the raycast is outside of the wall detection. All right, so let me re-opacity this. Okay, so once you set up the raycast, again, in all directions, then you can actually just make an object for it. And you set it up under the object connections here. And so, yep, we'll go over what the object actually does, but you're going to set it up as the object that's connected. And then this object switch, you can have a switch that says able to detect, not able to detect. I did it to the floor of this object so that it stayed relatively on point with it, since my origin is floored. And then we made it into child. This is very important because if we go to the object now, we can see that its parent-child relationship is that it takes the direction and it sticks with the parent. Notice everything else, I took off all those options. Right, so now further investigating this, you'll see that there's no really added variables or switches. And it starts off with the lift check hit on, and it's changing the parent object. The parent object is the player, and so it has a switch called lift checked hit. And so when the raycast is not detecting anything, it's turned off. And then the second that it hits an attack detection of a liftable object group, or a liftables group, then it will turn the parent object, which is the player, liftable check hit on. All right, and that's how you know whether you can grab or not grab. And then this one is if you're not hitting an attack detection. All right, so the player, in order to lift setup, has to have its lift check hit on. So that's what that raycast is doing. It's saying, hey, this object's liftable and the player's also in range. and when you press A, of course. And then also the same thing on the move, because you can be moving and also go into a lift as well. All right, so now let's check what the hit area is like. And so you can see that we have a pot here, and we also have a bush. These are the base objects. These are the objects that you see me placing on the scene here. Okay, so in their animations, if we go to the pot here, we can see that in the idle, I have an attack detection here. And it's just, I think it's the size of the wall detection. That's right. So whatever the wall detection was is the size of the attack detection as well. And so when the player's collider, or that child's collider hits this attack detection, that's when it's going to register that the player can lift that. All right. And you can see that that little shorter line of this raycast is going to give us more clarity of which object is being grabbed. So, and then the bush has the same thing where it has attack detection. So the only thing that you have to worry about actually is in the scene. Since, well, we can play test and show this off a little bit. So if we go to here and we say collision and attack detection, we can see that we have to at least just be a couple pixels apart in order to not grab the same pot or the same bush. And that's very easy to do and still look aesthetically pleasing in your game. You can see that these pots are exactly the distance that I need. So when I grab one, I only grab the one that this little raycast is checking. All right. So I'll just take these off. So that's really all that you would need to worry about in the scene, is that you're placing them in outside the range where that raycast thing could hit multiple objects. Okay, so now that we understand what exactly is detecting the grab, let's go into some of the grab logic, okay? So the first thing is let's just see what a pot, for instance. So on its idle, and then what it's checking is if the HP is 0. So if the HP is 0, that meant that you attacked it and it's going to break. And then in this particular case, after the break animation is done playing, it's going to change into a drop of a life. This could be so many different things. This could be a generate, and then you could have random chances for life drops. This is definitely not the video for that. So this was just what I did for this. All right, and then after that, this will destroy. It actually won't destroy because it changes, but this would be where the destroy goes. Okay, so now let's see how it goes to being lifted up. And so what is happening there is that it's within a collision detection of the other objects, the player lift check, okay? And that's a group. And then the other thing is that the player is in lift setup. All right, so before I go into the player lift setup, I just want to show you the groups that I have. I have the player attacks, which is something that I usually always do. So any kind of an attack, even in this case, the pot, when you throw it, it's considered an attack. So you'll see that that's where I use that. I have a player lift check raycast, and that is so that nothing else is ever associated with this object. I have neutrals, which is just a normal, pretty standard thing. And then liftables, and these are objects that will be lifted. Okay, you can choose to destroy them or not as well. All right. So now that we have that check, let's look at where this is happening, the player lift setup. All right, so in the player, when the lift check is on because you're hitting an object and you're in the lift setup, that's when the object that you're touching with that raycast is then triggered into a lift up. All right. When this happens, when the lift up is happening, and you'll see that the bush is the exact same thing. Whoops, that's not the bush. There we go. You see it has the exact same thing. And what it does is when it goes into lift up, it turns on the player switch of what kind of an object was picked up. So in this case, the lifted bush is turned on. In the pot's case, the lifted pot is turned on. And you can see that it then destroys itself because this object is no longer needed. We now need a child object that sticks with the parent. So in the in the pot's case, we can see that a switch, we have lifted pot. So it turns on lifted pot. And you can see that we have a connected object called lifted pot. And there is another child object called underscore lifted pot, and it needs this switch lifted pot to turn on, and it goes to the connection point. All right, so wherever the connection point is that you want, and you could rename this to whatever. I should rename this to lift point, but you can see that this is what it's doing, and we want it to maintain the we want it to be a child. All right, and that way we can have it have some of the settings. If we go to the underscore lifted pot settings, we can see that it sticks to parent. And again, it doesn't really keep much. It doesn't take anything as far as HP or attack detection, and it can take its direction, angle, stuff like this. Some objects might have different looks depending on the angle, so you might want it to take direction, and then you'd have multiple directions on that object. The pot was very simple. It looks the same no matter what direction. And you can see it has no real switches or variables as well. And all it does is when you spawn this item, so it goes to lift setup, and this lift setup is an animation. Let me show you it real quick. So the lift setup is an animation. It's just about 0.3 seconds long, but it's a little lift up. And you can see what I did is I scaled the connection point where I needed it during the pickups. And then in the end, this is the final area where that object is going to be. I did that for every direction. So it starts right there, picks up right there, and then ends right there. And so you can kind of see how this is looking. Then what I did is I made a lift idle, and this is going to be, it's going to have that last connection point that we used. It's going to be in the same position, and it's just going to be an idle of that animation. And then we have the walk, and the walk, you can see, just looks like that. It keeps this connection point in there, but you can see also that I change it every frame that it's like bouncing up. I put it up one, and then when it goes down, I put it down one, and that gives the pot that realistic bounce look as you're manipulating the animation there. All right, and then the last thing that I'll just go over real quick while I'm here is the pot throw. This is basically a reverse of the pot lift, the lift setup, and it just throws it. It's a little quicker too, because you need it to look quicker. But you can see that the connection point is also adjusting back to where it was originally at the first frame of the lift setup. All right, so that's really all we need to know about this. I guess we could go over the pot here. We have, you can see a lifted pot animation. So we have an idle. Particularly, this has collision detection, attack detection, and wall detection. So this is just it idle on the scene. We have the break, which is just when you break it. And this is also used for when you throw it and it breaks as well. And then we have the lifted one. And you can notice that this doesn't have wall detection, collision detection, attack detection. It only has a connection point. And then the bullet is when you throw the pot, I have a smaller wall detection, and this is just something I do for bullets anyway. I don't have the wall detections too big. And then we also have an attack detection. So if you didn't want this to hit when you throw it, then you would just remove the attack detection. You can see on the bush, as the bullet, I have a wall detection, but I just don't have a attack detection. And that's why the bush, when you throw it in this sample, doesn't hurt anything. All right, so that's really all we need to know. And so now we can get back into it. So when we lift setup, we do that little lift up. Once the animation is over, then we are in the lift idle. And the cool thing is that when we're in this lift setup is when the object transfers over and turns on the object that is to be lifted. So when we hit lift setup, we're getting the connected object, and the player doesn't have to do that. The object that we're lifting does that. All right, so that makes it really nice for us. And so now we're in idle, and this is basically the same idle move loop that we have down here. The only thing is that this is all we can do, or we can throw it. So that way it locks us out of, sword attacking or anything like that. So we have a little idle and move loop. well, this would definitely be no input. Let me see if this one's no. Okay, don't do no input. Definitely do, you know, the up, down, left, right, releasing, all ands. But for this case, a lot easier. All right, so here's your normal move loop. Now, if you want to throw it, you're going to press A, just as it seems natural. And then you're going to, this is a shortcut to the lift throw logic. And the reason I made this a shortcut is because this could technically be as many objects as you needed to throw. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go to this lift throw state, which it's going to lock out input. It's going to lock out direction changing, and it's going to go to the lift throw animation. And then after it starts that animation, it's going to then determine what object you're throwing. So if lifted pot is on, well, that means that you have a pot to throw. If lifted bush is on, well, that means that it's a bush that you're trying to throw. And so then respectively, you're going to go to throw a pot and you're going to fire a bullet pot at the connection point. And then you're going to turn off the lifted pot. Now that is going to then say that we don't want this object connection, because this is what's required for this pot to be enabled as a child and inherit all the children attributes. However, it does have a problem, because just because we turn off the switch doesn't mean that it gets rid of the pot. It will actually just disconnect it from the parent it will disconnect it from the parent. So it will lose all its parent-child relationships, and it will just be a pot that just sits there now. So what we have to do is we have to go to the lifted pot, and this is where you'll see the logic that if the player's lifted pot is off, it then goes to throw, which is actually really just destroying this one, because this is not the thrower. I think I attempted to throw it from this at first, but I found that it was much easier to manage from the player. So if that player's lifted pot is off, then it's going to destroy, because we do not need that child anymore. And so that's how you can get the smooth transition from the player carrying the pot to then throwing it with the bullet. And the pot bullet, we'll get into this in just a second. All right, so we throw the pot and we turn off the pot, lifted pot switch. Same thing for the bush, except for this time we do a bullet that is a bush. All right, and so let's look over this bullet real quick. Oh, whoops. And then let's just end this. So then when the motion is done, you can see that these take over motion. So it's continuing the motion that was started in this lift. It just instantly goes into this one, takes over the motion, and then once it's done playing, then it goes back to idle, and you can start going around or lift up more bushes or pots or whatever. All right, so we got some bullets here, and these are really simple. We just have the pot throws the bullet pot, the bush throws the bullet bush, and then we got, no limit on that in the shooter's direction. And that's really it. That's all this pot and the bush is. And so now if we go to the actual bullet here, there's a few things. You'll notice that when I throw, let me grab an object here. When I throw down, it throws straight. When I throw up, it throws straight. However, when I throw left, it kind of arcs and it curves. And when I throw right, it arcs and curves. Well, maybe we didn't see that. There we go. So what I'm doing is I'm actually controlling it in the bullet. So the movement of the bullet basically doesn't matter. I'm actually going to control it from this logic itself. And so that's why the bullet, it's so important that you have all 4 directions so that it can sense directions that it needs to go. So for instance, in the movement settings here, you'll notice that it is tank movement. And this is so that we can get the curved look as it's moving to the left or the right. So real quickly, I just set the normal movement parameters. I didn't up the turning speed. I like to leave these at 1 and then up the percentage as I need it, because I find that 1 is just a nice multiplier basically for percentage. And then we can go here. And so the start of the bullet is actually going to be erasing the bullet setting move, and we're going to be doing our own. So we're going to be moving forward whatever direction we're facing. All right. And we're initially not doing any turn, and then we're matching that movement. So since this is, since it takes over the player's direction in the bullet, then it's going to be facing the correct way. All right, so let's do the first link here. This is going to be the link that if it is going up or down. And basically we're just waiting for after a certain amount of time passes. This is how far you want the pot to be thrown or the object. And then we're going to do contact with a collision detection with another object, because you got to remember that this bullet has attack detection. And so if you want it to damage something, then this is where you would add your damage checks. You'll notice that this is an OR, so any of this can happen. And then it's instantly going to go to a break, which is going to do a move template setting of stop. So it's going to stop the movement. And then after the motion plays, it's then going to do the change live thing that I had in the original object right here. Okay, but now let's see what happens when you do a left or right. Now you need one for left and one for right, because depending on that, you're going to be turning a different direction. So the check is, and this is a right away check, so we can jump right to it. If the player's direction is facing left, then we're going to go to left arc down. And all we're going to do is we're going to change the back and forth motion to still be going forward, but to now turn left. And so what it's going to do is it's going to move forward, but it's going to turn a little left, and it's going to go down slightly. It's going to make it look like it's falling. And then in here, we're doing the same checks where we're either waiting the distance of the throw, or in this case, a collision detection. And then we just got the flip side on the right. If the player's facing right, then we're arcing, but instead of turning left, we're turning right. And so this is going to give us the arc this way. And so then again, after these checks, then it will break. So that is how the logic of the bullet's working. You can see that the bullet of the bush is the exact same thing. It's just the only difference is that it doesn't actually need this check. I left it in there because I copy pasted it. I will show an example of how easy this is to add new objects. Just it's very copy pastable. But this check is not needed for this bush. All right. And so once the bullet is thrown, again, you just go back to idle. And like I was saying, this is where you will add your other ones. So your rock, you could have a log, maybe a log. And this is where you just keep going with all your throwable objects. All right, so here I'm going to re-add the bush. You'll see that I have none of the bush objects. You can see that the player does not have the bush here. We don't have even the bush animation. I'm going to show you how quick this is. All right, so first thing you do is you add the bush resource 5 and 1. Next thing that you can do is you can then copy and paste the pot. We'll rename this bush. We're going to go to the animation settings here. We're not going to erase this. If we erase this, it'll erase all the work that we've done. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to change the image to the new bush here. We're going to hit OK. We're going to hit yes and hit OK. And now if you look at this, everything is back to normal, or it took everything's placement. The only thing that we need to change is we need to change the area for the wall detection, the attack detection, and the collision detection. And now what I'm going to do is, since we don't need anything in the break, we don't need anything in the lifted except for the connection point, which, to be honest, I don't think we actually need this connection point. I think I was using it when I was summoning the bullet from the lifted state. And so I'm going to get rid of this just to make sure that we don't need it. If we do, I'll just add it. And then on the bullet, the only thing that we have to do is adjust all of these, which I can do real quick. I'm just going to come to the attack detection. I'm going to copy it. Or, sorry, the wall detection. Here we go. So I'm going to copy the wall detection. We're going to go to bullet. I'm going to go to downward, copy paste. And then we're going to delete the attack detection because we don't want attack detection. That's what it is. All right. And then delete. add, and then delete. So a little bit of setup in this animation here. All right, and our animation is done. That's how easy that was. Now we're gonna come to here. First thing I want to do is I want to go to switches, and we're gonna add a switch called lifted bush. So this is required for every object that you want to throw. And then we're going to go to the pot here. We're going to copy paste this pot. I'm going to drag it down here so I know exactly where I'm working. We're going to copy paste the lifted pot, and we're going to copy paste the bullet pot. So we're going to rename pot to bush. We're going to rename lifted pot to lifted bush. And we're going to rename bullet pot to bullet bush. And then I'm going to change this to, instead of pot, be a bush. I'm going to hit OK. And then we're going to go to lifted and change it to bush. Hit OK. And then the bullet bush, we're going to change it to bush. The only thing is that we're going to take off the attack detection for the liftables because we don't want this bush to hurt anything. We just want it to destroy. You also notice that, let me do this lifted pot here. You also notice that I gave a display priority of 1 in the lifted pot. And then this bullet pot also has a display priority of 1. And matter of fact, let me just make sure something real quick. So we have our lift setup on our up. Okay, I was just making sure I didn't click set back of image. Okay, so moving on with the bush here. So now you can see that the pot literally transitioned to the bush animations. Once I changed its animations, it changed over. Very easy. All right. The only thing that we need to change here is, instead of turning on lifted pot, we want it to turn on lifted bush. The checks are the same. Those don't even need to be changed at all. Then we can go to the lifted bush here. We can see that it changed as far as what we need. The only thing that we have to do is change this to lifted bush, so that it's when lifted bush is turned off, then that's when this is destroyed. And then the last thing that we need is, well, let's check if we need anything here. This should be pretty good. This might be set up exactly the way that we need it. All right, so now we just need to do some setup in the player object. All right, and let's just make sure the scene, yeah, there's no bushes on there. So in the player, we're going to go to object connections first. We're going to copy and paste the lifted pot. We're going to call it lifted bush. Give it the lifted bush object. Give it the lifted bush switch in order to turn on. And then we're going to go to the bullets, and we're going to copy paste the pot. We're going to say bush, and we're going to give it the bullet bush. Now, a lot of these naming conventions will all be specific to your project. And then the last thing that we're going to do is we're going to copy this throw pot. We're going to copy this link. We're going to copy this link back because they're all the same. The only thing is that we just got to change what switch it is. So in this case, it would be the bush. If the bush switch is on, then that means that you're throwing a bush. And you're not throwing a pot, you're throwing a bush. And you're not turning the lifted pot off, you're turning the lifted bush off. All right. So now we can place a couple of these on the scene. So just do these normal bushes here. And now when we play test, if everything went right, we can lift them up and we can throw them. And yeah, that's how easy it is to add objects to throw with this sample project. So yeah, I hope you enjoy this video. If there's any questions, comments below, Steam or Discord, we'll get you figured out. And with that said, I'll see you at the next video.